was actually better than the first one. So welcome to the Toronto Spirit Society, all of you, incarnate and discarnate, and those who are also watching us through the internet. We continue in our journey to learn to study the epistles of Paul, not Paul Keogan, our friend, but Paul of Tarsus, the one that sacrificed his life for Christianity. And, many of us dare to say that he is responsible for carrying out the message of Jesus forward throughout the centuries, right? And his letters are just remarkable. So before we get into the lecture today from our dear friend and brother Paul Keogan, he will talk to us about the letters or the epistle of Paul to the Galatians, and he will explain who were the Galatians, right? Many of us don't know. We will start with our initial reading and prayer by our dear friend Jose Musi, who is back, and then we'll get into the lecture. We have our moderated chat on the internet with Livia, so if all of you on the internet, if you have any comments or questions, please talk to us or say hello, say where you are watching us from, and we'll be happy to have you participating. And at the end, we'll be back for some question and answers. So, Joe, please.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So let's start with a very short message from the book Happy Life. And this is psychographed by Divaldo Pereira Franco and from the Spirit, Joana de Angelis. So it is called Never Lose Hope. Whatever may happen, keep believing. If everything is against you and failure threatens you with despair, even then expect divine assistance. Only what is best for us happens. The law of God is the law of love, and love can do everything and does do everything. When you think that help will not arrive in time, if you continue hoping, you will happily discover that it reached you minutes before the disaster. The person who despairs has already lost part of the battle he was going to fight and goes forward at a disadvantage. So let's raise our thoughts to our dear God, our Creator. For He is the one that shines us with eternal hope. He has brought us together on this earth, on this day, to rejoice and open our heart to the loving words of the teachings that He has brought to us through His many messengers. Just as the rain showers the plants with life, let the words of wisdom and righteousness shower us with love and education and direction. Thank you, God, again, for giving us the intelligence, the desire, and the loving thoughts that drive us to learn, to concentrate, and to absorb all of the good lessons. We thank also all of the good spirits that come here with us every week, that help us prepare the material, prepare the lessons, protects us from all of the evil thoughts. May them continue to inspire us and our speaker Paul this morning. And let's be happy. Let's be hopeful. And let's keep the love in our hearts alive at every moment. So be it. Paul, it's all up to you now.
Good morning. I must say it is intimidating to be up here. I think everybody feels that, and sometimes you wonder why, and just because part of it is you're waking up on Sunday morning and it's kind of a heavy atmosphere. But I have two reasons I'll point out. One is because I think back at the previous speakers, and it's a hard act to follow. The level of presentations of the weeks previous to today, I hope you won't be too disappointed. But they are, the level of presentations and the material is so clear and so well that outside Spiritism I've never experienced teaching so, the profound teaching is so clear and so well presented and so perfect. The other feeling of overwhelming comes from the Paul, the apostle, and you think of his life, and most of us don't take time to think about it because you're too busy. Then you hear a few things that are very powerful, and maybe he was a powerful speaker, and you go on, and 5 minutes your mind is off on your daily chores, and that's probably partly why we have to come back over and over again and hear it so slowly. The truth, and even though the wonder of St. Paul becomes more real to us. So the epistle we've chosen for today is to the Galatians, and I'm sure, in a sense, if you think of the word Galatians, whether it's Galatia, Mesopotamia, Armenia, Tarsus, it's all over there someplace. But last Sunday we saw a nice map of that area, and we have a little map again today, so it becomes more real. It's not just a place on the other side of the moon that's we've discovered through very small pieces of literature, namely the New Testament, but it's more than that. It's a living place, and also you'll see the symbols that the writers use, and these three, I'll go to the next one. I guess I didn't get to it. Pardon? Oh, the remote. Okay. Let me see. No. So I have to use a remote to go forward, do I? Okay. I thought I could short circuit it here. These three quotes from the epistle were chosen by Emmanuel in his book called The Living Spring, and we'll refer to some other little bits, but these three were chosen by Emmanuel, and he develops what these quotes how they could be developed into some more extended thoughts and application to our lives, but it's not the only ones. And but the epistle that Paul wrote, you might wonder if you want to think about what is the difference between an epistle and the apostle, the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the Gospels. Are they the same? And are they a totally different viewpoint or perspective? Let's put it that way. If you think of it, they are, because the epistles are like when you read Emmanuel and Paul and Stephen in 2,000 years, you're reading somebody who was there. That's a bird's eye view, and that's different. I'm sure we've all read good novels, and they recreate well, but that is flowery language that is meant to excite your imagination, and hopefully you enter into that period of time. But the epistles of St. Paul are eyewitness accounts. That is as was happening. Whereas the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament was written many years later, and it was written in pieces and finally put together. So it's a description of what happened back then. Whereas when you're reading St. Paul, it's a letter. And the interesting thing I found, I hope you will maybe during the week ahead do this, read the epistle of Paul to the Galatians as one reading. Because first of all, it's a letter, and you feel the intimacy of the letter. It's not just a description of the difficulties of the early Christians in this little place called Galatia getting going, and understanding things the way they understand, the next day maybe understanding it differently, and maybe watering down what they thought they remember that Christ said from what they heard. They didn't have books then. They didn't have the information, and they whoever did write things down in scrolls, those scrolls were treasured. And the odd time you would get somebody who would dedicate many weeks of his life to reprint a scroll. And a scroll is just a dried piece of animal skin. So how they got those letters to stay on that dry piece of animal skin and stay there for many years is quite an achievement in itself. So it's just by way of putting it into context that is, these are personal letters. And the ones to Galatia are even more personal. Because remember, you'll see the map in a bit, Jerusalem was way down south from where Paul grew up. Paul grew up in Tarsus, which is kind of up north from where Jerusalem is. And if you went up north further and over the left, you would eventually get to Rome. But it's up north, and last Sunday we got a sense of the distance. So it's probably a few hundred kilometers north of Jerusalem. And that wasn't by way of Highway 400 or 427. That was probably a donkey trail. Unless they took the boats. But so it was rough. And that part of the world, the Middle East, the terrain is very rough. And so the only part that is really wonderful, like we would look out here and see our environment, is that land flowing with milk and honey. And the reason why it's called that, because that's the area close by, which is Mesopotamia. And there is the land, and when the glaciers would melt in Armenia, they would flow down and water the ground in between the two rivers, Euphrates and Tigris. That was the land flowing with milk and honey. And it was seen as paradise because there was things growing. The grass was growing, the trees were growing. There was life. It wasn't the tough. So I'm only saying that by way of background, that the life was tough for people in this part of the world. And also walking was tough. They didn't have suede shoes. They did probably have leather. I've never really seen them. They probably had leather sandals that were strapped on your feet. But any time you read and hear now again that first thing that people would do when they had a visitor come in your house is they would bathe your feet. And that wasn't just a ritualistic symbol that somehow they plucked out of the stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and those stories that took place 1,000 years before Genesis. That took place because when people came in and they walked the hard ground for 50 or 100 kilometers, and Paul would do that before breakfast. Like walk to Hamilton, that was not even, or maybe even at Kingston, that wasn't even thought of as anything extraordinary. But your feet would get blistered and they would get dry and eventually crack and actually bleed. So the bathing of the feet was very much a humanitarian gesture. There's a little bit of the, I can get the thing, okay. There's Jerusalem, and there's where Paul was born in Tarsus, and Galatia is up here. Now, where this little community of the Galatians actually lived, I don't know. Maybe some of the rest of you do. I couldn't pinpoint it, and maybe I should have done more research, but I'm sure it's in this area. And when you talk about to the Galatians, you don't think of a city, say, of the size of Toronto. It's a group of people, and the groups of people back then were called tribes. And even the Israelites are not one people. There are 12 tribes, and they're very different. They even spoke different dialects, and I think at times even different language. So they all followed the Ten Commandments and the law. The people here, there was a small group of people in here that they were neighbors from where Paul grew up. And I say that now, so I'll come back to it later, that there's a significance to that, because like they say in literature, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country. And when Christ was preaching, and they looked at him, they said, because the Jews had their level of hierarchy too within their own tribes, and all the tribes weren't considered equal. And they looked down on the tribe that Christ came from. And then they said, what good can come out of, I'll say Judea, I'm not sure which tribe, I forget, no, he came from, I think he spoke Samaritan. But they said, what good can come out of that tribe? This is the Jews talking about themselves. So they didn't honor him. And they said, furthermore, his father was only a carpenter, and we hear he was born in a manger. Like, he is teaching us something beyond what even when we get from the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. Like, who does this person think he is? So they knew him. They saw him grow up, and they heard him. They remembered him back in 12 years old, discussing the law with the priests of the temple, and but they didn't see him as having any right to give them any new version of things. And so I mentioned that by way of Paul's life does paralyze Christ's life a bit, because when he was, and this letter will show, he went to Galatia because he knew that area, and they were neighbors, not that far, because he grew up in Tarsus, and somewhere in here is where that tribe, those group of people. We say that the church of Galatia, we're not again looking at maybe a group as big as we are, probably less. It may have grown, it may have shrunk, but there wasn't the thousands of people. And I mention that now, and I also want to draw attention to, we know things don't happen by chance, but the reading this morning is the last message of the presentation today, of the need for don't give up hope. So but there was a disrespect. There wasn't the respect for Paul that he knew he earned, or he was given to him by Christ, and he had to point that out to him very forcefully. So it's just, and the reason is that they just saw him as one of the boys next door, and he was no better than us, and he may have claimed to have a great experience while on his road to Damascus one time, but so people do hallucinate, there is a cynical side to all our thinking, and maybe we can see that as well. So, go on to the next one here. The selection of Paul, it's worth thinking about again. We know he was high energy and totally dedicated to promoting the message of Christ, the salvation of Christ, what it means to know that Christ has come back, he died, he returned, there is a life after the grave, there is a big world out there, open our eyes, there's a sense of urgency. And so Paul had a tremendous sense of urgency, and but he wasn't even around when Christ was on earth. So if you look at the plan, and it makes you can think over and over again that the plan of God is not man's plan. If man's plan was to go out and convert the world, surely they would have taken one of the 12 who spent hours and hours with Christ. And if you read the gospel at home, you see the many hours that Christ spent with the apostles in the evening, explaining on how to apply and live the message that he wanted to give and share with the world. Paul wasn't around for that. And I was trying to think, and I'm sure some of you are better scholars of this than I am. How old was Paul when Christ died? My meandering of my thinking as I piece numbers together was, I would suspect he was around 10 years old. But you can, anybody comes up with a better estimation. I mention as an interesting point because there are many things that Christ didn't bother sharing with us, and Paul didn't, because I would have satisfied a curiosity, but the message of Christ and salvation was much more important. But sometimes we indulge in curiosities. And but anyhow, the thing is, Paul never mentioned that at all. And why was he chosen? The 12 apostles were well trained. They were dedicated. They weren't your average just believer. Only one of them died a natural death. I believe the other 11 were martyrs. So they were pretty high-level spirits, and yet God chose Paul. And Emmanuel points it out, and I picked it out. It's out from the book On the Way to the Light. And it's quite, I first saw it, and you may see it's a little bit shocking, but God's plan is not ours. And here's what it is. What Emmanuel says on the way to the light. The Master's apostles, even though valorous, fishermen, after the Lamb went back to the realms of the light, began to suffer the influence of Judaism. These are the 12 apostles who knew and had been trained and spent 3 years, very solid years with Christ. But I'll say a couple of comments and just to highlight that. The method of governance that the Roman Empire had and it was very act of genius, is they didn't do local governing. They collected the taxes. So they left the local governments, whatever they were, to carry on managing society and get the markets out on Saturday and get have the basically law and order in their little community. They left that to the locals, and so they the locals for many of the writings we have was the Jewish community, and they were very strong people. They were chosen people, so they were strong, and they kept their they kept their faith, and they gave the basis and the foundation that when Christ came, he could find 12 apostles who would immediately leave their boats and come and dedicate their life to his words. So but they weren't strong enough to do what Paul had to do. And that's, I would have thought without reading this that they couldn't get any stronger than the 12 apostles. But here's what he said: they began to suffer under the influence of Judaism. And that suffering we will see is that, and what will come up again, is that they really began to think, in order to keep the peace and not to offend the Jewish community, it would have everybody become Jews first and then just evolve into Christians. As though Christianity was just a hybrid of Judaism. And Paul had to combat that. And the 12 apostles, in order to keep peace, you see it written in the Gospels, if we don't keep peace, we'll get our head cut off, and who's going to spread the word? So there was a practical side to it, and they were martyrs. So they wanted to survive long enough within the Jewish community to spread the word and convert. But Paul said, we can't sacrifice the purity of the gospel of Christ. And so Jesus had to call. Thus Jesus decided to call upon the luminous and energetic spirit of Paul of Tarsus to help carry out his ministry. So he had to go, in a sense, I don't use this word pejoratively, he had to go above the commitment of the 12 apostles. Interesting. It's, I would never say it on my own, but that's what Emmanuel said. So this is getting into now the, oops, I need your help. Can you plug me back in here? I forgot to. No, I know I lost my page here. It's, I'm not too high-tech savvy here. But Paul gets right to the point. What happened was in Galatia, he had gone because he loved those people, and he was very familiar, very comfortable back home in his neighborhood. Thanks. Yeah, I'll keep touching it now. And so he told them, and within a short time, I can't say how many years, because he couldn't get back there every year, that the Christ message and what it meant to be a follower of Christ, and it didn't mean to be a Jew. But they suffered the influence. And it's interesting I say that. So we know, so the influence was, get circumcised, follow the dietary laws, and you don't eat with pagans. Can you imagine that? A good Jewish person at that time did not eat with pagans. Can you imagine anybody believing that could be against God's law to eat with your neighbor? Now I say that not to judge the Jewish people of that time, but to judge how we can get off from the real truth. And when I was looking at this, I was thinking, that's why Kardec came, to bring us back to the real Christianity. And how we strayed, and how quickly you look at the history of the church by, was it 392 or whenever Constantine came, that then Catholic Christianity became the religion of the empire. How they first made sure they didn't offend the empire, and then they taught Christianity after that. And so right away we know from history that reincarnation was taken out of the teachings of the church because it offended. And the compromise that goes on, we know even today there's a lot of spirituality out there, but we are, and what is insisted in it is that we are, and Kardec insists in this all through, we are Christian Spiritists. In other words, our guideline is the love of God and the love of neighbor. Everything else is an explanation of life. Spiritualists don't necessarily include that. So it's very, very important. But he says to the Galatians, I'm surprised that in a few years you could have missed the point. So normally we introduced an epistle, he sent a letter, he was very flowery, very complimentary, and we're so happy to see you keeping the good word. He went right to the point. He was agitated. And when he gets to the point. But he also, his love comes out, so he, in a sense, redeems himself. But, so let me just maneuver this along here. Okay, so let me go to the next one. So he had to justify him, but they looked on him. They said, they weren't going to just dance his tune. They said, okay, fine, we know you've had your experiences, but so he had to justify himself, and it annoyed him because he didn't claim any greatness. His greatness came from his faith that Christ had passed on to him. So then he says, then God, who has especially chosen me while I was still in my mother's womb, and chose to reveal his Son to me, so that I might preach the good news about him to pagans. So he was chosen to teach to pagans. When I use the word pagan here, it has maybe a bit of a negative connotation, but pagan was is used to refer to people who didn't believe in one God. It isn't that people didn't believe in God. The Romans believe in Jupiter quite strongly, and the Hindus believe in many gods. So there are many people who believe in gods. It's believe in one God. So they're the pagans. So Paul was justifying his authority, not authority he exercised on his own merit either. But here it comes. So he was saying he has a different mission, because while he was insisting on this in Galatia, back in Jerusalem they were still accommodating and allowing people to become circumcised and follow the dietary laws, and then go on and read the words of Christ and be Christian. It wasn't clearly defined. That was an evolution, and with God's plan we know there was a reason. But for Paul going to the pagan world, he didn't have to go through that delay. The pagans weren't Jews, so there's no point in going through that delay in order to get to the truth. Go straight to the truth, the teaching of Christ. So Paul was making it very clear that his mission was to be one to the pagans. So he says, help. It's not moving on here. I'm trying to get this to move on, but I think it's I'll try it again.
Here, this way.
My own.
Just the arrow
I know, but it's not moving. It's gone to sleep.
I think so. This one. It isn't?
All right, so it did.
Okay.
Stay close. So Cephas was one of the leaders in the community in Galatia. He says to them right away, you have no right to make the pagans copy the Jewish ways. That's strong language. And the other thing, this will come up over and over again, the law became for the Jewish people God. The follow the law was really to honor God. And so Paul makes a big issue of the law and the rituals, and that even today in Spiritism we're so careful. Don't develop rituals. Rituals, they can help to lead you to something better, but they can also dull you and let you stay there. And I think back over my growing up as a Catholic and following the obligations of the church. You went to Mass on Sunday, you went to confession Saturday night, you didn't eat meat on Fridays, and you felt pretty good. You were doing it right. But that was, there were actions. Where was my heart? It wasn't guaranteed at all. In fact, I felt very relieved after I came out of the confessional on Saturday night. Everything was looked after. Mind you, I knew I'd have to go again the following Saturday. So the rituals, they're good. They have a place, but they can dull you to the point of thinking that you've arrived, that you're doing all that you could do. So he points out over and again, following the law, the dietary laws, the circumcision and all that, does not save. And that back then, in a time when they didn't have maybe the same sophistication of knowledge that we have now, to have the law was so valuable. Like it was a treasure. It wasn't that it was not valuable, but that it was only to lead to the truth. It was not the truth. So he says here, the life I now live in this body, I live in faith. He stresses faith a lot, and even the Spiritist, we can learn so much. You read all these marvelous psychograph books. You know, in a way it can remind you of the very successful professor. And he had taught a lot of years, and he was pretty satisfied with his lectures and his preparations. And he said, but he made the comment that we can get caught up in as well as we learn a lot in Spiritism. He says, I taught them so well, he says, they didn't even have to think. That was, and then you can see, so we can learn so well that we just become like eaten a big meal. We feel like falling asleep. But we don't want to use that approach to life, because the big meal, the learning, is so that we can go out and live the faith that is within us. So so just it'll come out again and again. I just highlighted on a slide here. There's the difference between the ritual, the law, and living your faith. And if you were living your faith, we can say the same words. You can talk to somebody about, something you're excited about in Spiritism, and then maybe they hear and you can see their eyes glaze over after 2 or 3 minutes if they've had enough. And then you can talk, but if you're talking from your heart, even if the tone will be different. You may use the same words, but the tone will be different. And if the tone is different, vibrations into that person's spirit, different vibrations. And we know vibrations then will start to vibrate in their mind and their thoughts will change to the manner in which you were thinking. So the importance of speaking from your heart and from faith. So the difference between, but if you're just speaking from knowledge that you know this, it comes across very dry and very cold. In the teachings, Emmanuel and Paul, the metaphors or imagery is very valuable because but we know when we get the image inside us, then it starts to grow, because that is a construct of the brain. They used to say in sports, from the image comes the energy. And if you want to be a good tennis player or you want to be a good soccer player, you get the image of a great player doing that move. And that's in your mind. And when you're running into the corner to perform that same act, you hardly see the ball of it's tennis or whatever, but it's the image of the other person doing what you're trying to do that guides you and gives you the inspiration to do it. From the image comes the energy. And so in the great writings, even in this case, the title of the book, The Living Spring, it gives you an image. And if you take a time to really polish it up a bit, then you'll see. So if we have within us, we are a living spring, and we visualize ourselves as a living spring, then our words will bring life and give life to others the same way as fresh water, as spring water, as we mentioned in the previous presentation. Spring water gives life. It comes out of the ground, it's pure. The water that flows down the Don Valley may not give you good life. But the water that comes out of the ground is pure and it gives life. So that's the image that Emmanuel used, was living spring, so that we would see ourselves as giving life. And you will give it in such subtle ways that you won't even know. But if you are daily starting out on the right way, then it will happen. So he chooses Emmanuel chooses so he saw Paul we're going to review it now, as a living spring. His words gave life. Somebody else might have said those words and they wouldn't, but his words gave life. They're bringing the life of Christ to people who didn't see Christ, but they were hearing it almost like they were hearing it from Christ. So the first lesson that Emmanuel that is giving us is chosen from the Paul to the Galatians, and you'll see it's 6:1. And so Emmanuel wanted to emphasize what was Paul was doing, but he takes that quote and develops a whole chapter, maybe 2 or 3 pages on it in his book. It's called In the Regenerative Work. So it is number 37, chapter 37 in Living Spring, based on Paul's letter to the Galatians. And it says, "Brother, if one of you is caught in sin, you who are spiritual should guide him with a spirit of gentleness, watching yourselves so that you too are not tempted." And we know from, regular life, there's nothing worse than a reformed. They used to say years ago, nobody smokes now, but back then when people were realizing how bad it was, there's nothing worse than a reformed smoker. They just jump on everybody who's smoking, they tell them how bad it is. And now, of course, when we eat Monsanto food, everybody jumps on you. That's nothing bad than this genetically engineered food. And so you'll probably throw this person's plate in the garbage if they're eating their own food. And that's not the way to do it. And same way we know so much in Spiritism. Now, how can we balance it when we speak and live it? And the final balance will be simply love. It won't be the words. It has to proceed from love first. So that he's really warning them, because even among themselves they were having this in the Galatians. So if one of you is caught in sin, he doesn't mean caught in sin and say robbing the bank. It could be even an error or not living up to the standards that they knew. So it's when we're involved in the regenerative work, and that's the title Emmanuel gave choosing this passage, that there's a way of doing it that's important. So some of the guidelines that he gives in the book Living Springs, based on this quote from Paul to the Galatians, is, "Let us put ourselves in other people's shoes and remind ourselves that if we'd been in the same situation, we might not have resisted the suggestions of evil either." I don't want to get into history too much, but we see corruption going on in world soccer. We see it going on every place. And we see it, and I actually heard this discussion between Jewish people, and one confronted the other talking about the Holocaust. And they asked the other person, "Would you have put your head in the noose if you were living in Nazi Germany at that time? Or would you just prefer to keep quiet and hope that you wouldn't have to face the truth?" This was Jews talking among Jews, so there was a very genuine discussion on it. And they didn't answer just, "Oh yeah, I would have sacrificed," because we know how horrible that. If you were with Fifi and you had a chance to make 150,000 and everybody else was doing it, would you do it? It'd be so easy. Nobody says a word. We're not. The only reason for mentioning these examples is not to justify. That's a tough call. I mean, it's between you and God. But the only thing is that let's not judge the other person, because we don't know. And there used to be a saying in the counseling with alcoholics, "There, but for the grace of God, goes I." There, but for the grace of God, goes I. So in knowing a lot, that's a burden, and it's not to be taken lightly. So it says we will not lose anything if we exercise the respect we owe to everyone and to everything. Let us be humane before anything else. So if we use expressions of anger to try to guide others or sisters who are lost in the entanglement of error, all we will do is awaken their own anger against us. And we know that anger begets anger. We hear over and over again, violence begets violence. And there are a lot of places in the world who are very religiously oriented, but they would force you to follow and be religious. And how do you do that? Because the religion comes from, and belief real comes from within. They would force it very quickly. And there used to be a saying in counseling that you can't teach, you can't teach manners in an unmannerly way. You know, you can't shout at somebody else. Speak nicely to the other person. But you know, so they're obvious truths. But sometimes in the daily life, we miss the obvious. Another one is we know that philosophical arguments have nothing to do with charity and justice, and we can go on and say we know that an intelligent effect must have an intelligent cause. We know we can say that a clock doesn't invent itself. We can come up with pretty fancy quotes because we've memorized them. But is that going to convert anybody? It may open the door, but go carefully, because if it doesn't come with love and gentleness, what you have been fortunate to receive, or maybe been fortunate to review for 10 years, maybe the other person hasn't yet. So this is under the title that Emmanuel chose, when he chose these titles from Paul, with the title, In the Regenerative Work. And if there's anything that we're into in the world today, is the regenerative work of ourselves and the society that we move in every day. Therefore, with all our respect for philosophy, which asks questions, and for science, which provides answers, we will always recognize in Spiritism the active and renewed gospel of the Lord, or spreading with Jesus, universal love and divine wisdom. That is Spiritism. Everything else is extras that God at this time, because the world is in transition, has allowed us, Christ has allowed us to know, so that we can move on to a higher level. But that Spiritism is that last two things. Another one is, do not become weary. And we know that yes. Could you imagine, I was looking at this, I was thinking, could you imagine we're sitting here now, could you imagine 10 years from now we're sitting here, obviously we're 10 years older, a little bit tireder, maybe the kids are older, maybe they left home, maybe we retired, but the same thing, you're going through the same thing. Do you think you might have grown weary? And yet you think of Paul, he went to the Galatians, he went all over the Roman world. And I'm sure when he went into these little churches, what they call the churches, they were just a bunch of poorly dressed, maybe half-fed. Probably some of them didn't even know how to behave properly. They may have been uneducated, they may have been rough people. Could he have hoped that when he left the world, that would carry on? When even after he was away for 10 years or 5 years from the Galatians, they got so off the track, he must have wondered, okay, I'm going to give my best shot, but the 11 of the 12 apostles are already dead. So who's going to carry on the work in Jerusalem around there? And the rest, who's going to come to the other places, Rome and all of those, after I leave? They can hardly get along a year or two when I'm away. So that's why he started to write. He could have. I mean, he had every reason, human reason, to grow weary and think that. So we have to, I guess the message in really all of it is God's ways are not man's ways. And after that we apply it. The image, again, they use, and the imagery is so important, and good writers, and obviously Emmanuel is a good writer too, is they use imagery, because the image stays in their mind long after the ideas kind of get mixed up. So they use the image of sowing the seed and not being impatient. And you think of the seeds that Paul sowed. If he thought that 2,000 years later there'd be so much of the world not even paying attention to Christ's teachings, wouldn't he been? He probably couldn't have imagined it. And yet he went on. So the sowing of the seed is a good image that we sow it, the seed goes in the ground, there's darkness, and the growth is not ours, our responsibility. The growth really eventually is God's responsibility. The growth comes from Christ. So it's just another one of Paul's messages. And he continues to use the imagery of sowing. And that's sowing, that image of sowing and harvesting. Even if you all are city folks, you can all, everybody knows what sowing and harvesting is. Probably all of us have planted some little flower in our flower box on our balcony. So we all know that it goes down and there's something mysterious, and up comes that, and there's life. And then it comes up a twig, and mankind has never made a leaf. Yet the mystery of coming out of there's a living leaf. And we see flowers that look almost real, but they're paper. So the harvest that we're planting. And if we want the transition to happen in our lifetime, well, go easy. It's God's work, not ours. Never despair, help always. Perseverance is the foundation of victory. That's chapter 124 in Living Spring Emmanuel. The third chapter that Emmanuel was writing about, choosing a selection from Paul to Galatians, is whatever a man may sow, that also he may reap. You may think, well, here's a repetition we just said 2 or 3 minutes ago, but he develops it in a way that I think you'll find it quite interesting, and I certainly did too. Here's the part that it's not necessary to die physically in order to grasp the law of compensation. And this may be a bit shocking, because I know in Spiritism it's awfully relieving to think that, well, I have this miserable life because of something I did 500 years ago, and somehow you kind of shrug your shoulder and you don't take full responsibility for it. You can't remember it happening in previous lives because you don't know them. And so somehow you kind of meander on through your life as though it's a burden you have to carry, but you don't take any real personal guilt for it or personal responsibility for it. And so he's expanding here the law of compensation. The second point is expanding. We'll take each one individually. Is if we isolate ourselves from social life, depressing loneliness will be the world's response to us. And the third was, if we insult our job with laziness, our job will relegate us to ineptitude. These are 3 points that Paul takes, or that Emmanuel takes from the quote from Paul. So what Paul on the first one, what Emmanuel is highlighting in the first one is, many of the things that we are suffering today is because of what we did in this life. And if we haven't maybe controlled our anger in this life, and it may be because we're feeding it at times. So we can't blame everything on the past life. The law of compensation applies for this life as well as the baggage we bring from previous incarnations. And he's pointing that out so that we don't absolve ourselves. And there could be a bit of an escape hatch there in Spiritism. We blame it on past lives, and somehow that's far away. The other thing is that if we isolate ourselves from social life, and you see holidays and you think people are, a great life is just to get on the beach, be all by yourself, but and to withdraw and so forth. But we need other people. How do you be charitable if you're all by yourself? How do you deal with your anger if you're all by yourself? Well, maybe a branch falls off the tree and hits you in the head, you can get angry at the tree. But how do you learn to deal with the injustices of other people? You can't grow without other people. And many of us, even though we live in very busy cities, we live very isolated lives, and we don't know how to interact. And even the blessing of coming and being in a Spiritist group where you have a chance to, like we have on Sundays and during the week, I find it a big blessing, man. It's as you go home, you close your door, you get busy on the Facebook, and you go to work tomorrow, and it's next weekend before you know it, and you don't have much genuine interaction. But as we develop our faith, we find that even in the office, as we say good morning, we can say it in a different way. So some of the other qualities that Emmanuel is emphasizing in terms of from that statement, which is sow you will reap, is optimism and hope, stateliness of character, and pure intentions attract invaluable opportunities of help on our behalf. And if we start out every day expecting it is going to be a good day. And even modern psychology says that if you go out expecting it's a good day, it's more than likely it's going to be better. And we know in Spiritism, we know in neuroscience that if you open your door to bad thoughts, they'll come. If you think bad thoughts, they'll come to you. And if you think good thoughts, they will come to you. That's pretty established at certain levels in neuroscience, and it's the same thing that's been said here. So Emmanuel is highlighting again, one does not have to die in order to come face to face with justice. We can do it right here in this world. In accordance with the principles of cause and effect, we are incessantly confronted with its guidance at every moment of our life. So that's just his words saying that we are facing the justice that we have, the mistakes that we've done also in this world. This is a title of Paul called Liberty and Charity, because there's a tremendous liberty comes from knowing about life like we know it. But like the French have the expression noblesse oblige. So what you know, if you do know better, God expects more from us. So and that means more charity. So he's saying to them, because they, at times the Galatians, I think he was pointing, they were a little intolerant even among themselves and among the others. My brothers, you were called, as you know, to liberty. But be careful, or this liberty will provide an opening for self-indulgence. Serve one another rather in words of love, since the whole law, love your neighbor as yourself. If you go snapping at each other and tearing each other to pieces, you had better watch out, or you will destroy the whole community. What we can apply to here, we can apply to our families. We can get so high in our thoughts, but when the actions that's another challenge. So the fundamental principles of Spiritism, and this is what St. Augustine wrote, and I thought it would be good to add it here, because observe that the fundamental principles of Spiritism are the same everywhere and must unite you all in common thought, love of God, and the practice of the good. The final aim is always the same, doing good. And here's an expression, I'm sure you're going to smile when you read it, because imagine St. Augustine pointing out such so obvious, but it's so wonderful. The final aim is always the same, doing good. And as you know, there's not two ways of doing it. You can draw your own conclusions with that, but isn't that nice? Paul, the Galatians again, 7 to 10, he says, do not delude yourself into thinking that God can be cheated. We may think because we are, we come in here, we all look pretty good spiritists, but and we fool each other. And maybe some days we are, but we don't know. Maybe some of you have done a lot better than we know when you keep it hidden, maybe some less. But God can be cheated. And we know that, but it's nice to hear. Just hearing it reminds you. And tying it in with the message from the beginning is we must never get tired of doing good, because if we don't give up the struggle, we shall get our harvest at the proper time. And the careful thing is not for us to choose the proper time. That's God's plan. While we have the chance, we must do good to all, and especially to our brothers in faith. Oops, sorry. Can't forget. Let me see. Do I have 5 minutes? I would like to read one little. Can I go 5 minutes? Okay. There. So I'll repeat, but I hope that Paul's letter is a letter, and it's very intimate, and you feel the intimacy of a letter. It's a different intimacy than comes from the Gospels. Not to compare them, they're different, very different issues. But the Gospels are a description of something that happened. Most of the writers who actually compiled the Gospels were not apostles, and some were not even maybe around, or maybe never even saw Christ. So they're the best accurate description of what Christ said and did. And that's the ones that Christ and God chose us to know. So that's good enough. But when you read Paul's epistle, it's a personal thing. And letters are personal. And sometimes you know how embarrassing that can be if you write a personal email and you click the wrong address. And you say things that, and not that you say things bad, but the other person's going to hear them out of context. So, but if you I say this: if you read I hope you'll commit to say maybe this week. It's only 5 or 6 pages. To take the whole epistle and read it as one epistle, because he comes in hard. He hits the points that need to be done. He doesn't try to curry favor by saying how great they are when they're making mistakes, but he does do it with love. But to get the whole package, and to really get the epistle of Paul to the Galatians, it would be good to good to know. Here's the last little reading. And this is what is called the epilogue. And Paul, when he was writing this, he had other people. When he was dictating this, he had other people writing and scratching it on the animal skin that was the leather that we call scrolls. So, but the last he decided to write himself. And I don't know how much he wrote. He was an educated man, so obviously he could write. But here's the epilogue. And he wanted them to know that he wanted the Galatians to know how personal this letter was, that he actually took his own hand and wrote the epilogue. And here it is. Take good note of what I am adding in my own handwriting and in large letters. It is only self-interest that makes them want to force circumcision on you. They want to escape the persecution for the cross of Christ. Now, what is there is that if you became Jewish, you wouldn't be persecuted as much, because the Romans didn't want to upset the Jews too much. They wanted to have a peaceful community and pay your taxes. So there was a certain protection becoming Jewish. So Paul is pointing out to them, don't hide under that cover. They want to escape the persecution for the cross of Christ. They accept circumcision, but do not keep the law themselves. They only want you to be circumcised so that they can boast of the fact. For me, the only thing I can boast about is the cross of Christ, through whom the world is crucified to me and I to the world. It does not matter if a person is circumcised or not. What matters is for him to become an altogether new creature. Peace and memory to all who follow this rule, who form the Israel of God. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for taking us through the journey. And when we do this deep dives, we actually understand a little bit of the context behind each letter, right? It's very interesting. As we discussed a few weeks ago, we see Paul and Emmanuel very close as older brothers, and sometimes they really pull our ears when we are doing wrong things, right? And that's exactly what was happening with the Galatian community. Any comments or questions from anyone before we wrap up? Now we are on top of the hour. Joe, please.
Just wanted to kind of recap that we spent the whole month talking about Paul. And obviously the messages that he left us through his letters are incredible and so modern. It's still applicable to us as it was 2,000 years ago. But there's also, and Paul, our Paul brought that up, is why Paul? Before he went on that journey to Damascus, anybody who knew Paul, or was it called Saul, he was the last person anybody would think would take on this mission. He was a Roman. He was one of the Jewish leaders of his community. He fought against the Christians. He basically saw them as a threat. So suddenly he has this life-changing experience, and now he understands why he came to that life. What's also very important for us to understand is Spiritist, that at that moment, he begins a new life, and he doesn't spend a lot of time kind of renouncing everything that happened before. He doesn't renounce the Jewish as being evil or anything like that. He doesn't feel the compulsion to be overly hard on himself for all of the mistakes he made. He doesn't talk about that. He takes on a very positive, forward-looking approach. He wants to have a new faith. He had a faith before. He had the Jewish faith. It's not like that moment is the first time he ever had a spiritual faith. But now he sees the light, he understands the mistakes, but he also understands that we're all imperfect. And that this is part of the process, and that we should not be always going back to the past, punishing ourselves over and over for our mistakes. Because the best thing we can do to atone for our errors or sins is to spread the good word, to be charitable, to be loving, and to bring others into that same kind of energy level. And that's why he talks about it. If you see somebody sin, help them. Don't judge them. Don't punish them. Help them. And make sure that you don't get dragged into the same temptation. And that's what he did for the remainder of his life as Paul. So not only is the Paul's message incredibly important, Paul as a person, because we look at him as an example, it says, if he was able to do it, why can't we?
Yeah. Exactly. Nothing is by accident, right? He was chosen, I think, exactly to give us that hope. And for more that in one day you were going in a totally different direction, all of us, one day or another, we will understand the message of Jesus, will answer his call, and will turn around and move toward the direction that we are meant to move. So, very, very well put. And final comment is that he wrote so many letters, and he actually became a letter of Christ to us, right? A living letter, as Emmanuel says. And, as you were saying, Paul, it's easy for us to come here and give a lecture. But that's just a tiny bit of what we are expected to do. We are expected to be that living letter. And gradually we will become, right? It's easy for us to memorize chapters and versicles, but to live them, that's the difficulty. But that's what we are supposed to do. And as Paul always had faith that things would come in the proper manner, we, as Christian Spiritists, we should have that faith. Sometimes we're desperate, right? You were saying about his concern, will the message be carried out forward when I discarnate? And he always trusted. He said, I did my part, I fought the good battle. Now, and that's why last week we discussed about Timothy, he left Timothy in charge as many others, right? So we should have faith. That's the big message for us as Christians, to strive to do our best and to have faith and trust. We do our part, our guardian angel always is going to do his part. Jesus and the higher spirits, they will always do their part. May not be what we expect, but it will be for sure what we need. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paul, Teresa, Nadia, and everyone else. Thank you for watching. We will go to the classes right now, and we'll have a few announcements next week, as we have a great lecture next week. We'll tell you our special guest very soon. Thank you very much. Have a blessed week. Can you, stop recording?